On the surface, the Kahler family seemed like the perfect picture of the American dream: a successful husband, a loving wife, and 3 bright, promising children. They lived in a beautiful home, actively participated in their community, and appeared to have it all. But as we often learn, appearances can be deceiving. Behind the smiles and the polished image lurked a darkness that no one saw coming. This is the story of James Craig Kahler, a man whose obsession with control and revenge shattered the lives of those he was supposed to protect and cherish. The unimaginable happened: the brutal killing of his own family. But how does a respected engineer, a man with a seemingly perfect life, spiral into such unspeakable violence? Could anyone have predicted the tragedy? And most importantly, could it have been prevented? In this deep dive, we'll recount the chilling events of that fateful night and explore Craig Kahler's descent into madness. We'll look at the warning signs, the family dynamics, and the broader lessons society can learn from this tragedy. Stay with us as we uncover the hidden nightmare behind the Kahler family's seemingly perfect life, a story that will leave you questioning just how well we truly know those closest to us. To understand the tragic unraveling of the Kahler family, we need to first understand James Craig Kahler himself. Who was this man before the headlines? Before the horror? Was there any hint of the darkness that would eventually consume him? Craig was born in 1963 in the small town of Weatherford, Texas. Growing up in a conservative, traditional household, he learned early on the value of hard work, discipline, and ambition. His father, a stern but loving figure, was a respected community member who instilled in Craig the belief that success was non-negotiable. It was the ultimate proof of one's worth. From a young age, Craig exhibited a natural aptitude for problem solving. He was the kid who took apart radios just to figure out how they worked, much to his mother's frustration. Teachers quickly noticed his sharp intellect, especially in mathematics and science. It was clear he was destined for a career that required precision and logic. After graduating near the top of his high school class, Craig earned a scholarship to Texas A&M University, one of the top engineering schools in the country. At university, he thrived academically but remained socially reserved. His world revolved around numbers, structures, and systems, things he could control and understand. People, however, were more complicated. But then came Karen N. White, a humanities student with a radiant smile and a heart full of compassion. She was everything Craig wasn't: warm, spontaneous, and deeply empathetic. Their paths crossed at a campus event, and despite their differences, sparks flew. Karen saw something in Craig that others often overlooked: a deep desire to be understood and accepted. Their relationship blossomed, and by the late 1980s, they were married. Friends described them as the perfect balance, the pragmatic engineer and the creative dreamer. Karen was born in 1965 and grew up in a close-knit family. Her upbringing was filled with love, music, and a sense of community. She dreamed of making a difference in the world, but when she met Craig, she chose a different path, one centered around supporting his career and raising a family. Their early years of marriage were filled with hope and promise. Craig's career took off as he quickly climbed the ranks in the engineering field, while Karen dedicated herself to creating a warm, nurturing home. They welcomed their first child, Emily, in 1991, followed by Lauren in 1993, and finally shone in 1999. To outsiders, the Kahler family seemed to have it all. They lived in a beautiful suburban home, attended community events, and were admired by neighbors. Craig's high-paying job as a utility director allowed them a comfortable lifestyle. Vacations, private school opportunities, and family barbecues were regular parts of their lives. But perfection often comes at a price, doesn't it? As Craig's career flourished, so did his need for control. Engineering had taught him that with the right calculations, any problem could be solved. Unfortunately, he began applying this mindset to his family life. Karen, who had once admired his discipline, started to feel the weight of his expectations. Craig's perfectionism was no longer limited to his job, it seeped into every corner of their home. He scrutinized household expenses, demanded detailed reports of Karen's activities, and established rigid schedules for the entire family. Dinner had to be served at a specific time, homework completed without delay, and weekends meticulously planned. Karen confided in her sister that she often felt more like an employee than a wife. Despite their comfortable life, she was emotionally drained. Craig's controlling nature wasn't overtly abusive, but it was suffocating. His punishments were subtle cold silences, passive-aggressive remarks, and an ever-present sense of disappointment. Still, Karen tried to keep the peace for the sake of their children. She wanted to believe that Craig's behavior was just a phase, a byproduct of work stress. But deep down, she knew something was fundamentally wrong. In an attempt to reclaim a sense of self, Karen found solace in fitness. She joined a local gym, which became her sanctuary. It was there that she met Sunny Rice, a vibrant and charismatic fitness instructor. Sunny brought joy and energy back into Karen's life, reminding her of the person she used to be. Their friendship blossomed, and Karen began to realize something profound: she no longer loved Craig. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. How do you walk away from a life you've built for decades? How do you explain to your children that sometimes love isn't enough? When Karen finally mustered the courage to tell Craig, his reaction was unsettling. He remained eerily calm, suggesting an unconventional arrangement, a love triangle where he could still be involved in her life. Karen and Sunny rejected the idea outright, setting Craig on a dangerous path of jealousy and rage. This moment marked the beginning of Craig's descent. His need for control, already teetering on the edge, spiraled into obsession. The man who had once been a respected engineer and devoted father was unraveling before their eyes. As we move forward, we'll explore how Craig's desperation led to the ultimate betrayal, a crime that would shock the nation and leave a family shattered. At first glance, Craig Kahler's desire for structure and order seemed admirable. It was, after all, one of the qualities that made him a successful engineer. But within the walls of his home, that same need for control began to erode the very foundation of his family life. Karen had once admired Craig's meticulous nature. It gave her a sense of stability, knowing that Craig always had a plan. But as the years passed, his perfectionism became suffocating. What had started as simple requests like keeping the house tidy and sticking to a schedule evolved into rigid demands that left no room for spontaneity or joy. Craig wanted to control everything: the family's finances, Karen's daily routine, even how the children spent their free time. He scrutinized every household expenditure, demanding detailed explanations for the smallest purchases. Karen was expected to be home when Craig returned from work, with dinner ready and the house spotless. If Karen deviated from these expectations, Craig's punishments were subtle but deeply hurtful. He wouldn't yell or raise his hand; instead, he would retreat into cold silence, withholding affection and making her feel invisible. Karen began walking on eggshells, constantly trying to anticipate Craig's moods to avoid his disapproval. It wasn't just Karen who felt the weight of Craig's control. The children, too, lived under his watchful eye. Homework had to be completed perfectly and on time. Weekends were meticulously planned, leaving little room for the carefree joys of childhood. Emily, Lauren, and Sean grew up knowing that their father's approval was conditional, granted only when they met his impossibly high standards. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of Craig's control was his emotional manipulation. He had a way of twisting situations to make Karen feel guilty, even when she had done nothing wrong. If she expressed unhappiness or frustration, Craig would dismiss her feelings, accusing her of being ungrateful for the life he had provided. Karen confided in her sister that she felt trapped. She loved her children dearly and wanted to protect them, but Craig's dominance left her feeling powerless. She was expected to manage all household duties to his precise standards, adhere to rigid schedules, and even maintain a schedule for intimacy, a cold and mechanical approach that left Karen feeling more like a possession than a partner. Despite her growing unhappiness, Karen tried to convince herself that this was just the price of a stable life. She reminded herself of the good times, the early years when Craig's ambition had seemed admirable rather than oppressive. But deep down, she knew something had to change. Seeking an escape, Karen found solace in fitness. Joining a local gym gave her a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in years. It was there that she met Sunny Rice, a vibrant and energetic fitness instructor with a contagious zest for life. Sunny's friendship was a breath of fresh air for Karen. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen and valued. Their bond grew quickly, and with it came a realization that Karen could no longer ignore. She didn't love Craig anymore. This was a turning point, one that would set off a chain reaction with devastating consequences. When Karen finally told Craig that she wanted out of their marriage, his reaction was unsettling. He didn't shout or beg; instead, he proposed a bizarre solution: an unconventional love triangle where Karen could continue seeing Sunny while remaining married to him. Karen and Sunny rejected the idea outright. Craig's calm facade cracked, revealing a seething jealousy and rage that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. His need for control, already teetering on the edge, spiraled into dangerous obsession. Desperate to regain his grip on the family, Craig made a drastic move. He relocated them to Columbia, Missouri, hoping that distance would sever Karen's ties with Sunny. But it was too late. Karen continued to see Sunny in secret, and in early 2009, she made a decision that would forever change their lives. She filed for divorce. The children, having witnessed their mother's newfound happiness, supported her decision. This was the ultimate betrayal in Craig's eyes. His wife had chosen another person over him, and his daughters had sided against him. Craig's resentment festered, growing into an all-consuming obsession. He began stalking Karen, calling her incessantly, and even attempting to plant a hidden camera in her home. His behavior became so erratic that it cost him his job, stripping him of the very identity he had built his life around. With nothing left to lose, Craig moved in with his parents, his mind spiraling further into darkness. The once respected engineer and family man was now a shadow of his former self, a man driven by revenge and a desperate desire to reclaim control at any cost. As we move forward, we'll explore the events leading up to that fateful night when Craig's obsession turned deadly, forever shattering the lives of those he claimed to love. For years, Karen Kahler had lived her life according to Craig's rules. She was the devoted wife, the meticulous homemaker, and the caring mother. But beneath the surface, she was withering away a shadow of the vibrant woman she had once been. Craig's control over every aspect of her life left little room for personal joy or freedom. But all that began to change when Karen discovered a new passion: fitness. It started innocently enough. She joined a local gym to stay active and carve out a small space for herself amid the chaos of family life. At first, Craig tolerated it, dismissing it as a harmless hobby. But what he didn't realize was that this simple act of self-care would become Karen's path to liberation. The gym became Karen's sanctuary. The rhythmic pounding of her feet on the treadmill, the clang of weights hitting the floor, the upbeat music pulsing through the speakers, it was all a welcome escape from the suffocating atmosphere at home. Here, she wasn't just Craig's wife or the kids' mom. She was Karen, a woman rediscovering her strength. It was during one of these gym sessions that Karen met Sunny Rice, a charismatic fitness instructor known for her infectious energy and positive outlook on life. Sunny had a way of lighting up any room she entered. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and Karen quickly found herself drawn to her. Their friendship blossomed quickly. For the first time in years, Karen felt truly seen and heard. Sunny wasn't just a friend, she was a reminder of the person Karen used to be: confident, joyful, and full of life. They spent hours talking, laughing, and supporting each other through life's challenges. As their bond deepened, Karen began to realize something profound: she no longer loved Craig. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. How do you walk away from a life you've built for decades? How do you tell your children that the marriage they grew up watching had become a prison? But Karen couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Sunny had shown her what it meant to be truly happy, and Karen wanted that for herself. She found the courage to confront Craig, hoping they could part ways amicably. Craig's reaction was unsettling. He didn't explode in anger or beg her to stay. Instead, he suggested an unthinkable solution: an unconventional love triangle where Karen could continue seeing Sunny while remaining married to him. Karen and Sunny rejected the idea outright. They wanted a clean break, not a twisted compromise. Craig's calm facade began to crack, revealing a seething jealousy and rage that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Karen's decision to leave marked the beginning of a dangerous turning point. Craig's need for control, already teetering on the edge, spiraled into obsession. He became fixated on Karen and Sunny, unable to accept that his wife had chosen happiness over the rigid life he had imposed. Desperate to regain control, Craig made a drastic decision. He moved the family to Columbia, Missouri, hoping that distance would sever Karen's ties with Sunny. But it was too late. Karen's love for Sunny only grew stronger, and she continued to see her in secret. In early 2009, Karen made a decision that would change everything. She filed for divorce. The children, who had witnessed their mother's transformation, supported her decision wholeheartedly. They wanted their mother to be happy, even if it meant breaking away from their father. This was the ultimate betrayal in Craig's eyes. His wife had chosen another person over him, and his daughters had sided against him. His resentment festered, growing into an all-consuming obsession. The man who had once been a respected engineer and devoted family man was unraveling before their eyes. Craig's descent into madness was swift and terrifying. He began stalking Karen, showing up unannounced at her home, and calling her incessantly. In one particularly chilling incident, he attempted to plant a hidden camera in her house, desperate to monitor her every move. When his behavior cost him his prestigious job, Craig's world crumbled further. Stripped of his professional identity and rejected by his family, he moved in with his parents, a broken man consumed by bitterness and rage. With nothing left to lose, Craig began plotting his next move, a move that would forever change the lives of those he claimed to love. As we continue, we'll delve into the harrowing events leading up to that fateful night, the night when Craig's obsession turned deadly and left an indelible mark on the Kahler family legacy. By early 2009, the cracks in the Kahler family were no longer hidden behind closed doors. Karen, emboldened by her newfound love for life and her relationship with Sonny Rice, had made a decision that took unimaginable courage. She filed for divorce. After years of emotional suffocation, she was ready to break free from Craig's suffocating grip. But for Craig, this was the ultimate betrayal. Craig Kahler had always prided himself on control over his career, his household, and most importantly, his family. In his mind, the role of a husband and father was to be the unquestioned leader. To him, Karen's decision to divorce was not just a personal rejection but a direct threat to his identity as a man. He simply couldn't accept it. Karen's announcement was met with eerie calm. Craig didn't yell or beg, he simply sat in cold silence, his expression unreadable. But beneath the surface, his mind was racing. Divorce wasn't part of Craig's carefully constructed world, and he would do everything in his power to stop it. Craig tried every tactic to regain control. He pleaded with Karen, promising to change. When that didn't work, he resorted to manipulation, reminding her of the stability he provided for the family. But Karen had made up her mind. Years of emotional manipulation had worn her down, and there was no going back. Craig's desperation quickly turned into obsession. He began calling Karen incessantly, sometimes multiple times a day. If she didn't answer, he would leave long, rambling voicemails, alternating between pleas for reconciliation and bitter accusations. His behavior escalated further when he started stalking her. He would drive past her house late at night, park nearby, and watch from a distance. Karen knew he was there, his presence a constant reminder that he was always watching. Karen's friends urged her to report Craig's stalking to the authorities, but she was hesitant. He hadn't physically harmed her, and she feared that involving the police would only provoke him further. In her heart, she wanted to believe that Craig was simply struggling to cope with the divorce and would eventually move on. But Craig was far from moving on. his obsession grew more dangerous with each passing day. In one particularly chilling incident, he attempted to plant a hidden camera in Karen's home, desperate to monitor her every move. When Karen discovered the camera, she was both furious and terrified. Craig's erratic behavior didn't go unnoticed by his employer. Once a respected utility director, his inability to focus on work and his increasingly hostile demeanor raised red flags. It wasn't long before he was asked to resign, stripping him of the professional identity that had defined much of his self-worth. Now jobless and living with his elderly parents, Craig's world had crumbled. The man who once commanded respect in his career and community was now a bitter, broken figure consumed by rage and humiliation. Meanwhile, Karen was flourishing. The children, particularly Emily and Lauren, supported their mother's decision to leave Craig. They saw the joy she had rediscovered and wanted that happiness for her. Sean, though younger, sensed the tension and seemed relieved by the newfound peace in the household. Karen's happiness only fueled Craig's resentment. In his mind, she had stolen his family and turned his daughters against him. His jealousy of Sonny Rice, who had played a pivotal role in Karen's transformation, intensified. Craig's obsession with Karen was no longer just about control, it was about revenge. He couldn't fathom a world where Karen and the children thrived without him. In his twisted logic, if he couldn't have them, no one could. In the months leading up to the final tragedy, Craig's behavior became increasingly unstable. He continued to stalk Karen, monitor her activities, and fantasize about ways to regain control. Friends and family grew concerned, but no one could have predicted just how far Craig would go. As we move forward, we'll explore the horrifying events of Thanksgiving night, a night when Craig's desperation turned deadly and left a trail of heartbreak that would haunt the Kahler family forever. Thanksgiving, a time for family, gratitude, and togetherness, was supposed to be a joyful occasion. For the Kahler family, however, it would become a night of unspeakable horror, a night that would end the lives of those who had once been Craig's entire world. What began as an ordinary holiday gathering would soon spiral into a massacre that would forever mark the Kahler name with tragedy. It was November 28, 2009, and Karen, along with her 3 children, had traveled to her grandmother's home in Burlingame, Kansas, for the holiday. Dorothy White, Karen's 89-year-old grandmother, had long been a fixture of the family, a loving matriarch whose home had always been a safe haven for Karen and the children. This Thanksgiving, like so many before, was meant to be a quiet celebration, a respite from the chaos that had taken over their lives. Unbeknownst to Karen and her family, Craig had been watching their every move, obsessing over the idea of his family's freedom. He had already made several attempts to regain control, but each one had failed. Karen had grown stronger, more resolute in her decision to leave him, and the children were fully behind her. In Craig's twisted mind, their rejection was a wound that would never heal. On the night of Thanksgiving, after a day spent with Dorothy, Karen, and the children were preparing to return home. They had no way of knowing that this seemingly mundane evening would be their last. Craig had been waiting, biding his time, knowing that Karen would be in a vulnerable state away from the safety of her home, surrounded by family, yet with the isolation of being in a different place. The seeds of violence had been planted long before this night, and now Craig was ready to take matters into his own hands. According to later reports, Craig had been following the family from a distance, waiting for the right moment to strike. As Karen and her children made their way to their grandmother's car, they were unaware that the man who had once been their father, their husband, was lurking in the shadows, preparing to destroy everything they had known. At 10:30 p.m. that night, a neighbor reported hearing multiple gunshots coming from Dorothy's home. The chaos that unfolded inside the house would be almost impossible to comprehend. Craig had arrived at the house, armed with a .22 caliber rifle, and with ruthless precision, he began his attack. His first target was Karen. She was shot twice, execution style, in what can only be described as a cold and deliberate act of murder. Emily, the 18-year-old daughter who had always been close to her mother, tried to run and hide. But Craig wasn't done. He found Emily, gunning her down as she attempted to flee for her life. The young woman, terrified and in pain, had no chance. Lauren, just 16, was next. She was found critically wounded, still alive but unable to escape. In what must have been a heartbreaking final moment, Lauren pleaded for help, calling out in desperation. But her cries fell on deaf ears, as Craig, filled with rage, shot her as well. The final casualty of the night was Dorothy, Karen's grandmother, an elderly woman who had lived through decades of hardship, now facing a violent end at the hands of her own son-in-law. By the time the police arrived at the scene, the horror was complete. The house was a blood-soaked testament to the unthinkable. Karen and her daughters were dead, and the only survivor was 10-year-old Sean, who had somehow managed to escape. Sean's escape would later be described as nothing short of miraculous. In the midst of the carnage, the young boy, frightened and in shock, had hidden in the darkness of the house, silently evading the killer. Craig had no idea that Sean had managed to get away, leaving him to flee into the night, alone and scared. It wasn't long before the police began to piece together what had happened. Craig, having committed the brutal murders, was nowhere to be found. He had vanished into the night, and a massive manhunt was launched. The police were soon on his trail, following a series of clues that would ultimately lead them to his location. Hours later, Craig was found wandering aimlessly, detached from reality, a man completely unraveling. When the police arrested him, he offered little resistance, almost as if he had resigned himself to his fate. At first, he confessed to the murders, describing how betrayal had pushed him to the brink. But when faced with the looming threat of the death penalty, Craig's story began to shift. He claimed that he was legally insane, that the events of the night had been the result of a breakdown, a moment of uncontrollable rage. But the courts were not convinced. Kansas had abolished the insanity defense years earlier, and Craig's plea of insanity was rejected. The jury found him guilty on all counts of murder, and in August 2011, he was sentenced to death for the cold-blooded murders of his wife, daughters, and mother-in-law. Despite multiple appeals, Craig's conviction and death sentence remained intact. His fate was sealed, but the consequences of his actions would reverberate far beyond the courtroom. As for Sean, the sole survivor, he was raised by his grandmother Dorothy, and despite the unimaginable trauma he had endured, he eventually rebuilt his life. but the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain with him forever. The Thanksgiving Night Massacre was a devastating tragedy, a reminder of the darkness that can exist behind closed doors. It raised questions about control, obsession, and the lengths to which someone will go when they feel they are losing everything. The night of November 28, 2009, would forever alter the lives of those who survived. The brutality of the killings, the cold execution of Karen, Emily, Lauren, and Dorothy left an indelible mark on the community. The question that loomed over everything, however, was not just why Craig had done it, but whether he deserved mercy. Was he a man driven by uncontrollable rage, or was he a cold-blooded killer who had planned his actions with chilling precision? Craig's arrest came just hours after the massacre. He was found wandering aimlessly near a gas station, disoriented and clearly in shock. His eyes were vacant, his movements sluggish, as if he had completely detached from the world around him. When the police apprehended him, they initially struggled to make sense of his demeanor. Was he guilty? Was he remorseful? Or was he mentally unstable, incapable of understanding the magnitude of what he had just done? At first, Craig did not resist arrest. In fact, he was eerily compliant. He seemed to accept his fate without a word of protest, offering no explanation for his actions, at least not immediately. When questioned, Craig seemed almost detached from the reality of his crimes, his response to the officers' inquiries as flat and emotionless as his earlier confession. During his initial confession, Craig explained that his wife's betrayal had driven him to the edge. He spoke of how Karen's affair with Sonny Rice had torn him apart, how her decision to divorce him felt like the ultimate rejection. Craig insisted that he had felt abandoned, alone, and desperate. In his mind, taking the lives of those who had rejected him was the only way to regain control. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Craig's justification was rooted in a darker, more calculated form of control. His actions were not those of a man who had snapped in a moment of blind rage. Instead, they were the actions of someone who had carefully planned each step, who had methodically prepared for the day he would take his revenge. Craig's decision to murder Karen and the children was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. He had been stalking Karen for months. He had been attempting to monitor her every move, trying to undermine her happiness and her independence. In the weeks leading up to the killings, Craig's behavior had become more erratic and obsessive. And yet, he never once expressed true remorse for his actions, only frustration over his perceived loss. As the trial began, the world watched with bated breath. Craig Kahler, once a respected member of his community, now stood accused of 4 brutal murders. The courtroom became a battleground, with both the prosecution and the defense presenting their cases. But at the heart of the trial was one central question: was Craig legally responsible for the deaths of his family, or was he suffering from a mental breakdown that rendered him incapable of understanding the consequences of his actions? The defense argued that Craig was legally insane at the time of the killings. His attorney painted a picture of a man who had suffered from intense emotional distress, a man who had been unable to cope with the overwhelming sense of betrayal and rejection. They claimed that Craig's actions were driven by a mental illness that had clouded his judgment and made him unable to control his violent impulses. However, the prosecution countered with a different theory: that Craig's actions were calculated, that he had carefully planned the murders and executed them with chilling precision. The prosecution argued that Craig was not insane but rather a man driven by a thirst for control and revenge. His lack of remorse, his premeditated actions, and his attempts to cover up the crime all pointed to a cold, deliberate murderer. The jury was left to weigh the evidence: Craig's apparent emotional breakdown versus his calculated behavior in planning and carrying out the murders. In the end, the jury reached a unanimous decision: Craig was guilty on all counts of murder. At the sentencing hearing, the question of mercy remained unanswered. Craig's defense team requested a lesser sentence, pleading for the jury to show mercy due to his apparent mental instability. They argued that Craig had been a man broken by years of emotional pain, and that he did not deserve the full weight of the law to fall upon him. But the families of the victims, along with the community, were firm in their stance: mercy was not an option. The grief and suffering caused by Craig's actions were irreversible. The lives he had taken, his wife, his daughters, and his mother-in-law, could never be returned. In August of 2011, Craig was sentenced to death for the murders of Karen, Emily, Lauren, and Dorothy. The jury's decision was clear: this was not a man to be given mercy. The emotional and physical scars left on those who survived the massacre, especially Sean, the young boy who had lost everything, were proof enough of the devastation Craig had caused. Craig's appeal attempts have since been denied. His death sentence has remained intact, as the legal system has shown no tolerance for his claims of insanity. Craig's life now exists in a state of limbo, awaiting the inevitable conclusion of his criminal actions. But the real question remains: could anything have been done to stop Craig before the bloodshed? Was there a point in time when intervention could have saved the Kahler family? The tragic truth is that emotional abuse and obsession often go unnoticed, until it is too late. The Kahler case raises difficult questions about mental illness, accountability, and mercy. Was Craig a man so consumed by his emotions that he was no longer capable of making rational decisions, or was he a man who simply chose to ignore the consequences of his actions? The legal system may have ruled, but for those who lost loved ones that fateful night, the question of whether Craig deserved mercy will never have a clear answer. Thank you for joining us in this deep dive into the tragic events surrounding the Kahler family. As we reflect on their story, let it serve as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked emotions and the need to recognize the warning signs of toxic relationships before it's too late. If you or someone you know is in an abusive relationship, whether emotional, physical, or psychological, please seek help. Until next time, stay safe, and remember that the stories of the past are not just tales, they are lessons for all of us.